Okay, here we go, people. Um, I'm very pleased to have prepared for this session. Coming to Freiburg this year, thinking about the Bible, I went to two of my great teachers that I wanted to focus on because they were so important at Freiburg. It feels sort of like an appropriate place to work, to be able to kind of do something significant and in a tribute to great teachers among us who are now present in the spiritual world. And Bill Woofenden had such an enormous role to play in a particular way in my formation around the inner sense of Scripture. And it's a part of his thought that at one time with his students was a really big piece of their education. But it's a part of his thought that never got beyond that classroom and is not particularly well known. And so I'm just going to go through my slides so that I'm not going to vary too much, because somebody told me yesterday they had to go back and forth between me and the slides. I'm going to try to stick with my slides without too much commentary, and then see how that goes, and then we'll have discussion. But I call it his breakthrough paradigm. And it's a breakthrough, I think, in a way much bigger than me. And I think it's a breakthrough in the history of world thought around spiritual formation. And that's a pretty big claim. Let's see how I do with that. So in my first semester as a PhD student, which was 2001, I was in my very first fundamental methodologies class with a really world famous New Testament professor named Sandra Schneider, a great Johannine scholar. She assigned readings of and commentary upon, in one session, upon early church biblical allegoresis that struck me as eerily similar to Swedenborg's inner spiritual sense interpretation of Bible passages. These were some sermons from late antiquity. During class discussion about these striking sermons by late antiquity figures such as Origen, Augustine, and Ambrose, Dr. Schneider's commented, "Well, there was certainly a long history of that," which piqued my interest, and I stayed afterwards to speak to her, and learning about that became a multi-year project that led me to see Swedenborg as a consummate late-stage performer in an approach to sacred text that was at least 2,000 years old. Bill Woofenden's paradigm breakthrough is the piece that completed the puzzle, which will be coming up in upcoming slides. So let me make an overarching comment about correspondences as an approach to a literary text. We can talk about correspondences happening with anything that exists in the natural world, that there's a correspondence to something spiritual. So Swedenborg has that part of correspondence going on in his philosophy. But most of the time he's using correspondence with the biblical text, that there's correspondences in the biblical text. So it's important to claim for this larger history that correspondence is a form of allegory. Allegory derives from a Greek word whose etymology is to speak, goria, to speak, to be garrulous, to speak, alle, of something else, to speak of something else. In an allegorical text, a second meaning other than what the plain sense of the text is saying extends over all or some part of the text. When you see this word, it stands for that. This stands for that. Famous examples of literary device of allegory were with works that were intended to be allegory consciously by the author: Apuleius's Golden Ass, Ovid's Metamorphoses, the famous John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, in George Orwell's Animal Farm. The real meaning of the text is conveyed through a coded understanding of the plain sense of the text. Allegoresis, check that word out, allegoresis. This is the practice of figuring out what the meaning is. That's how it's used in professional circles. That is so any Swedenborgian minister has developed an allegoresis around their attempt to interpret the meaning of the text. Allegoresis is the practice of constructing these other meanings from the plain sense of the text, and what's used is, or in that this stands for that, is analogy, metaphor, metonymy, tropes, types. Canonical allegoresis is the practice of shaping this some kind of inner sense, some kind of allegorical meaning from sacred texts that for all intents and purposes were not understood for a long time to actually have been intended to be read as allegories by the authors of the text. So that's called canonical allegoresis. Allegorical meanings constructed at much later dates have been performed on almost all of the great sacred tradition texts. That includes out of Hinduism, the Bhagavad Gita. It includes, before any of the Abrahamic religions, the great mythologies that were sacred texts. In the time of Plato in particular, allegoresis began being performed on texts like the Odyssey. And then, of course, the Abrahamic religions, but of the Jewish and Christian and Muslim traditions. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, I'm already on the next slide. That's good. So Swedenborg, we know a lot about what he read, which has never been a serious topic for most Swedenborgians. Swedenborgians, I'm digressing a little here before I get into this slide. Swedenborgians, in my experience, spend, if I put it into break up 100% into percentages, spend 95% of their time talking about the influence Swedenborg has had on the world, and 5% of the time on forces and sources in history that had an influence on Swedenborg. Because Swedenborgians as a world movement tend to believe Swedenborg was only influenced from heaven, and that he was getting this straight new story from heaven, and there was nothing coming from the earth. But we now, those of us who care about Swedenborg's sources, know that there was a lot in his notebooks. Those 20,000 pages that went from his house to the Royal Academy of Sciences with a lot of notebooks of his notes, which is not even inclusive of his life, because we know that one of his favorite things to do in his first 15 years of traveling Europe was to visit libraries. He writes home, he loves going to libraries, and notebooks from that period are lost. But we know from the later notebooks that he was reading a lot of these people that you see on this slide, and was quite conversant with the traditions and structures of thought that they had around some of the important questions of interpretation that are going to become very real for him in a short period of time. And my contention, getting straight to the slide here, is that Swedenborg is more interesting to scholars when he's situated historically in a complex social and philosophical set of currents, rather than presented as a standalone oracle who's getting everything from God in heaven. It's also more truthful. Next slide, please. There we go. Full disclosure, this topic is the subject of my became the subject of my dissertation. It's titled, "And Speaking of Something Else." Oh, and speaking of something else, biblical allegoresis, Swedenborg, and tradition. George Dull served on my committee as the outside reader. He was often a hard sell on my work. He came along pretty okay. Bill Woofenden plays a crucial role in the argument that comes forth. And George, even though they commuted to SSR from Sharon, more than a half an hour away, however many days a week, close to 5, didn't seem to talk about what they were teaching in their classes too much. Because George, when I asked him, when I was showing him in the dissertation work, it all is right there in Bill's doctrinal, what we call docpats, doctrinal patterns in the Arcana class. It's all right there. And did get that? And he goes, well, I never really knew what he taught in that class. So next slide, please. Yeah, so Doc Patch is this legendary first semester course every Swedenborgian seminarian had to take right when they came into the school. He developed it during the 70s, shaped what became this massive, massive course. He finally publishes it in the Arcana. He had all these charts, and Bill Woofenden, and Van Dusen, they had a really close relationship, by the way. Van Dusen was really thought Bill hung the moon, and that he was a brilliant scholar, and they had a very warm kind of correspondence with each other. And so in the early 90s, Van told Bill, chided him. Van was blown away with his Doc Pat's course. These 12 charts that were strewn around the room in the classes, that he's never published them. So he did publish them, and there's all these charts that look like this that we obviously can't get into here, but I thought I would bring along a little show and tell of this complex structure that Bill developed out of the Arcana. So the Arcana is Swedenborg's magnum opus, right? Everything that he ever writes about in subsequent works in the writings had a beginning in some way in the Arcana. And it's his mother lode of information of the writings. And it's interesting that in some ways the Arcana is not studied as much as in that sort of complex way as one might have thought. In a tradition where there's scads and scads of intense true believers about every word that Swedenborg ever wrote. Before Woofenden, the best book, I found it back here, the best book ever done on the Arcana was William Wunsch. He had been a professor, a very controversial professor at the Swedenborg School. He was fired for taking too many liberal academic approaches from scholarship outside of Swedenborgian into the text. And he was rehired by the faculty, rehired by the Board of Trustees only to teach biblical languages. Bob Curvin was one of his students at that time and said, well, that's crazy. You teach languages, you have to talk about the words. So William Wunsch could sneak in everything he wanted to say while he's teaching Latin or Greek. But this book is called The World Within the Bible, and it's a book about everything that's in the Arcana. And what Woofenden did in Doc Pat's was far more extensive, far deeper, far more complex than what William Wunsch did here. Can I have the next slide, please? So these charts, I've already shown you these 12 fold-out charts. They're very complex. Can I go to the next slide, please? It's important, before I kind of show you the results in a couple of slides, to talk about Swedenborg's language games. One way that we know that Swedenborg was not taking dictation from heaven was that he was constantly evolving his language and going back and forth between different words. There was plenty of cross-outs in the original manuscripts. And he did not settle on standardized language for the inner senses of the text in the Arcana. What we will see is that in the charts, Swedenborg grouped all of his references into 4 topics, that there are 4 topics that are always the subject of the inner sense arc. the speaking of something else arc off the text. They always land in 4 themes, 4 topics. We'll take a look at those in a second. But it's also interesting to note correspondence itself as a word. It's a very late-breaking word in Latin. It's called Neo-Latin. It did not exist before Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas and his teacher, Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, they were brilliant Dominican philosophers, mostly working in Paris, were working with Aristotle's philosophy and needed a word that could capture the idea that something that is held in the mind exactly perceives what is outside of the mind. And there was not a word in Latin that satisfied them with that. And so they ended up taking the word respondere in Latin to respond and put a co or a cum with it so that it's co-responding. That these 2 very different discrete places are dynamically matched together and are co-responding. When there's a perfect alignment, there's correspondence. There's an energy system there, all right? So Swedenborg starts playing around with correspondentia as a word for the first time in a published work. He's already using it in his unpublished notebooks a decade earlier, but he publishes it for the first time in the Economia Regnum Animali, as George Dole translates that title. It's not Economy of the Animal Kingdom where you see beavers and squirrels making deals over here. The Latin means the dynamics of the soul's domain, which the subject was, how is the soul actually operating in the physical body? That's why Swedenborg went into anatomical studies. He was after, how does the soul operate in the physical body? Where is it? And because he was Cartesian, he's a neo-Cartesian philosopher. Descartes, the one who said, what's the deal here? How can we have these 2 reality systems? A physical universe that we see all around us, which he calls res extensa, things extending physically. And then we have this personality, this invisible, immaterial personality, res cogitans, the mental psychological world. It's called the Cartesian split, the brain-mind split. What's going on with, how come we can run as fast as we can across the room and this immaterial thing sticks with the physical body? So Descartes frames the Cartesian split, which is still not solved today. We're still arguing about it today. There are people who say, oh, well, come on, the great physicalists among us in culture, clearly the mind is a byproduct of the physical brain. But there are still plenty of others who have a more Platonic view of creation, that there's an anterior force, possibly a vital force, that is manifesting a physical plane in which to exist. And there are a lot of physicists who now believe in up as many as 11 or 12 dimensions, right? So we're still dealing with this relationship between the physical and the immaterial. And so Swedenborg was reared in that, and he lives his career as a neo-Cartesian. He's hanging out, he's in dialogue with people like John Locke, Malebranche, Leibniz, Spinoza. These are all philosophers in the 2 and 3 generations, even Isaac Newton, who are working after Descartes, working on Descartes' great question around the brain-body, the mind-body split, or the physical and the spiritual. So Swedenborg, with his language games, he's picking up on correspondentia, but he's also reading a lot of Hermetic texts. They're in his library at his death, despite what a couple of branches of the church claim was in his library when the estate was sold, that the Hermetic texts were actually the featured books in the library. They're the most expensive books because they were lushly illustrated, right? Swedenborg had plenty of Hermetic texts in his library at the time he died. And there's a lot of words going on in that philosophy that was also dealing with the Cartesian journey of the relationship of the immaterial and the physical, the properties of minerals, the properties of stars, astrology, which becomes astronomy, and so forth, the property in minerals, which becomes alchemy, which becomes chemistry. These are all going on in these conversations, and Swedenborg is using a lot of different words in these earlier notebooks for this relationship, similitudes and so forth. But he finally settles on correspondence as his favorite word. Could I have the next slide, please? All right, let's get to the chase and I'll finish. What we're seeing here, I'm going to show 2 slides about some of what's in these charts. So Bill tracked all of the language that Swedenborg uses because what's happening in the Arcana? Right, let's remember it's a verse by verse move through Genesis and Exodus. The text of the Bible is always the subject, even though he has interchapter articles on theological topics, right? And so he's talking about the Bible and he's saying there's an inner sense. There's a move, what we call a move on the text. He's not going to just talk about the literal level of the text. There's a move on the text, that there's an inner sense to it. And so he's using language around that. And so the correspondential meaning, he's still not calling it entirely a correspondence. Correspondence as a term comes up in different forms of the word maybe 20 times in volume 1 of Secrets of Heaven or the Arcana. But he's using all these other terms. So these numbers that are in black are the number in the Arcana where you can go find this particular reference. So you see 9 options there. He says, well, the abstract sense of this, well, the heavenly sense of this, the internal sense of this, the representative sense of this, etc. Now, so that's the overall topic. That's the overall approach to this idea that the world doesn't know that there's an inner sense to the text. That's his premise as he goes in to the writings. I mentioned before there are 4 topics. There's 4 themes. There's only 4 subjects that are dealt with in a spiritual fashion, not only in the Arcana with the first 2 books of the Bible, but forever in the rest of Swedenborgian interpretation of the Bible. So the fourfold sense, well, we got the one on the left. That's the literal sense, right? So now we're just talking good old Martin Luther. Everything the text means is in the plain sense of the text. The plain sense of the text was a gigantic argument from the Protestant side in the Protestant Reformation. That's the literal sense. So but even there, he has 14 different terms that he uses for the literal sense. But then here's the 3 inner senses. There are terms referring to the Lord's process, which we know is the glorification process. But he says, well, he calls it the celestial sense and the highest sense and the highest internal sense, the inmost sense, the supreme sense. Another theme is always individual people, little human beings. And so there's the spiritual journey of an individual as a theme. And then there's that famous theme of his about the churches or the epochs. That's human history in its collective sense. So if we add all of the numbers up between this slide and the previous one, Swedenborg uses 42 terms to describe the inner senses of the text in the Arcana itself. It does get more simplified. So Kent yesterday provided the very common place of landing in the Swedenborgian tradition. By the time we get to the end of the tradition, it's understood that there are 3, now this is a different word than topic. There are 3 levels of the inner sense. And that probably needs to be unpacked a little bit too. Well, what do you mean by levels? You're talking. One's like 20 feet up, and the other one's, what are levels in the text, right? But that's the traditional paradigm. But Woofenden's paradigm is the four. So that the traditional one is the natural on the left there. That's the letter of the text. That's the literal sense, right? And so then there's two inner senses, right? You go from the natural into the spiritual into the celestial, right? But Woofenden's paradigm does something incredibly important in world scholarship for placing Swedenborg in the broader, what I would call an interdiscursivity with thought that long preceded him, and that he's actually one of the latest stage in history clear practitioners of it. And so the spirituals actually split into two topics. They both deal with human beings. One is individual journeys, the other is humanity as a collection. So in the spiritual and celestial topics, inside the sense of the letter, there are two subjects: the Lord, God, and people, us. And what happens with Woofenden is he's able to splay out and says a lot of times we need to splay that human piece out and see that there's two separate themes that are going on talking about people. So, can I have the next slide, please? What's known as the fourfold sense of Scripture was an enormous model. I'm talking it's one of the biggest journeys in sacred text interpretation, period. There were hundreds of practitioners, famous practitioners of the inner sense that really gets going with Origen, who is late second, early third century. Origen builds the first systematic structure of the inner senses of Scripture. And he was down in Egypt, Alexandria, and it becomes known as the Alexandrian tradition. And from there we're running. But Augustine's very important here. There's never been a single study on Swedenborg's use of Augustine. When we look at the Philosopher's Notebook, Swedenborg, which is this 600-page book, that's only some notebooks that he did for 2 years in the early 1740s. We see all the stuff he's reading. He's copying out these long passages from scores of writers. He's not a blank slate being talked to only from heaven. I do believe he's talked to from heaven. I think his spiritual states of experience are an enormously interesting study. I think he had immense experiences that are very challenging to really interpret and understand, and I've been with it for decades, and I'm going to keep going with it. But he had earthly interlocutors as well, and there were a lot of them. And so, but Augustine is the most important. Well, who was Augustine? Well, Luther. Well, Swedenborg was a Swedish Lutheran, came from a very powerful Lutheran family. His father was dean of the cathedral at Uppsala, becomes a bishop, was one of his professors for 2 or 3 years before he became bishop, and then he only lived with his older brother-in-law, Eric Benzelis the younger. And Luther, what was Luther? Luther was an Augustinian canon, right? There's one Augustinian college in this country, and it's Villanova. He was an Augustinian canon, and Augustine is probably, along with Aquinas, the two most influential Catholic authors in history. Historians will usually make that claim. And Augustine is the major central construct of Lutheranism for a long time. When Swedenborg starts one of his set of notebooks that become what's known as the Philosopher's Notebook, that 650-page book that shows all that stuff that he was reading, he has 14 writers that he lists at the very, very beginning that are important writers for him to study. Only one of them is not a modern writer, modern in the sense of his own time period. Swedenborg actually was a typical Protestant in that he didn't think the earliest part of the church was important. Everything was messed up, right? That you couldn't really go back that far and get the straight dope. He was reading contemporary philosophers, contemporary thinkers, but he puts Augustine down as a most revered father. His work on Augustine is extensive, and he read at least 6 of Augustine's books very thoroughly, and there's a lot of vocabulary he picks up from vocabulary that works into his vocabulary as a theologian. And so anyway, after Augustine's the first one, he has a book that Swedenborg does deep thought in. It's called On Christian Scriptures, I believe. And there he lays out his construct of these 4 themes in Scripture. And then right after Augustine, the next century and a half, John Cassian, early Middle Ages, who added the 4th level to Origen's 3 levels. Cassian adds the anagogic state here, which is this bottom one. Anyway, there's the poem goes, Lettera gesta docet quid credas allegoria moralis quid agas quo tendas anagogia. The letter teaches events. Allegory is what you should believe. Tropology or morality is what you should do. Anagogy is where we're all going. Anagogy means upward leading. It's the higher destinies. All right. Now for the big slide. Here's a comparison chart of the 4-fold exegesis across the Abrahamic religions and Swedenborg. These are in chronological order from left to right. The Christians mostly did it first. Ironically, Philo was even earlier, but Philo was not a rabbi. I mean, he's a major figure in Jewish history, but he was not a rabbi. And all of biblical interpretation was fiercely guarded by rabbis. The rabbis paid no attention to Philo. A major cultural critic, but Philo was known in the first century, and Paul of Tarsus, who writes the epistles, uses typology. Even in Galatians, he does an allegorical take on the wives of Abraham with Sarah and Haggai. That one stands for the mountain of the law, the old world, the old way of religion, and the other one stands for the mountain of the gospel and the new way. You know, famously, Paul believes that Jesus completely put an end to the Hebrew model of religion. It was a good stage; it got it to there, but we closed the door on that. That ends up being a complex argument. But anyway, Christians develop a powerful, long tradition. The Sufis are next. They see what's going on, especially on the Iberian Peninsula, where all 3 major Abrahamic religions have big groups. There were a lot of Christians, a lot of Jews, and a lot of Muslims in the early middle to higher Middle Ages on the Iberian Peninsula. And you can see a lot of text going back and forth. That's where the Zohar was written, in the Iberian Peninsula, the great Kabbalah text of Judaism, and that's going to be late medieval period. So you see that there's this 4-fold structure that's developed in Christianity by Cassian in the early 6th century. And then we get the Sufic version of it, and they get going with the Quran. The Sufis are the mystics in Islam. The Jews then come back to it. The Jewish folks come back to it. Moses de Leon is believed to be the primary author of the Zohar, and that's late 12th century. And then Swedenborg, but the Reformation and the Renaissance sort of squash all this tradition, both in secular ways and in religious ways. The whole inner sense tradition collapses, and it goes nearly underground. And by the time Swedenborg comes around in the 18th century, there's no game in town except with some of the Freemasonry groups, and there's some underground Hermetic life. But Freemasonry and the Hermetic currents did not participate. Many of them belonged to churches. Many of them had their sort of secret way of being dual citizens, but they did not penetrate the thoughts of organized religion itself. They were separate bodies of thought. So Swedenborg, in my opinion, me learning from Bill Woofenden primarily, is that these, you can see with the internal historical and the spiritual sense, that's where he takes the human piece, the spiritual sense, and shows that there's actually two topics that are going on. There's two themes that are going on when that is the inner sense subject of a particular verse. He's frequently, in Swedenborg, he will at times use multiple inner sense meanings, but most of the time he's not. And it's hard to know, he never comments it in a particular way. I have made the claim before, but I get called on it, and I don't know really, I'm undecided about what Swedenborg really thought, if there can be multiple inner sense destinations of the same verse, right? That we can be talking about 2 or 3 even of the inner sense themes that are operative in the same verse. So, last slide, please. No, next slide. Well, I've already been through that enough. Last slide, next slide, please. Yeah. So Bill Woofenden produced by far the most extensive and thorough study of Swedenborg's magnum opus that's ever been done. Like an archaeologist, Bill excavated an underlying structure throughout the arcana that, when cleaned up, reveals a story about the inner sense of the Bible and how they relate to our lives and our destiny. A crucial truth that emerges from this excavation is that Swedenborg is more deeply implicated in a long spiritual quest for plumbing the depths of sacred texts presumed to be given to humanity by God. Swedenborg emerges as a latter-day exemplar of an ancient tradition who not only illuminates anew the spiritual foundations of Jewish and Christian scriptures, but who contributes powerfully to that tradition, as well as to the lives of those who take it on and recognize the power and genius of Swedenborg's contribution. So today, I want to lift up joy and gratitude to Bill, and am forever amazed that I had the chance to learn from him. It's one of my favorite pictures of the family mobile of the Woofendens, and that's what I have for you all today.
Jim, if I could ask the first question, what is the green volume that you showed us the charts in? The green volume, what is the, you're still on, that's good.
Turn it off, right?
No, because you're going to answer questions.
Okay.
So keep that on. But I'm just real curious about this. I learned Doc Pat's from the Studia. Oh, so that's just a hardcover of it. Because there were 4 Studia volumes, as it mentioned in one of the slides, and that had the charts in them. And when you put all 4 of them together, it was an incredible learning journey. Absolutely.
Just a comment, I haven't had such a wonderful smorgasbord or meal of theology since Bill and George used to lecture here. And I really enjoyed it, and you were so animated and into it. It's, I am overfull, and I thank you.
We actually have a Woofenden kid in the room.
My question is about the early Christian authors like Origen and then the Zohar writers, did they ever refer to the evidence in the original texts that there was an internal meaning? Like in the Gospels, it says everything that Jesus taught was a parable, and Jesus expounded the inner sense of the entire scriptures on the walk to Emmaus, and then there's also Psalms that talk about it
Yeah.
as well.
It was in both well, see, the Kabbalah has never been particularly centrally affirmed in Judaism. It's gone through its phases. It's been completely rejected for much of Jewish history. A way out of bounds, crazy approach to the text. However, Gershom Scholem started, and he himself was not necessarily, he was the great scholar in the 20th century. He was the great scholar of a reprisal of Jewish mysticism, and still just amazingly world famous. I mean, he's been gone for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years. So that and then the inner sense of the text began this way in Christianity. We mentioned Paul. Paul had this total rejection, this total convinced sense that the book was closed on the Jewish text, right? And so there's this enormous, so Paul, in the book of Acts, we have this story of Paul's a Hellenized Jew. Paul's a Greek Jew. He was way up north. And he comes, and so as the Jesus movement gets going, and Paul, originally a persecutor of Christians with his famous conversion experience, and becoming the most powerful, effective evangel of Christianity, is going all over the place outside of Palestine, having this kind of new way of understanding what the Messiah is. The Messiah, of course, had been prophesied by the Hebrew text. And he goes down, then they're supposed to have a meeting of minds. He travels down, has this famous meeting with Peter and James and John. And he can't believe they are still following the Levitical laws. And he says, and so they have that big argument, what really happened with Jesus Christ, and the way he critiques Judaism and what he claims to be doing. And they do not come to an agreement. Very famously, they agree to disagree. And so there are what are known as that the Palestinian Christians were still a sect for 2 generations inside of Judaism, just like Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes. They were a Christian sect with having a particular teacher within Judaism, whereas Paul was creating a new religious movement outside of Palestine. Fast forward about 150 years. Well, because eventually the Jewish Christians get expelled with the Great Diaspora, where Jewish people were expelled as well, with Nero in the Common Era, the year 70. So it's not too long before everybody's outside of the palace, outside of the Holy Land. And what's going on is this argument. The first time we get an indication that Christian writings, because they were doing their own writing, were starting to be referred to as on par. That's the word, that's the phrase in 110 that's actually used. That we have Christian writings that are on par with the scriptures. And there was particularly an epistle from Peter. You get the sense of another kind of text emerging. By the time you get to Marcion, one of the biggest fights in late antiquity is Marcion. Marcion is super Pauline. Paul's been dead a while, and Marcion is trying to get this movement going that completely shelves the Hebrew Bible. That it doesn't even exist physically in their spaces, and there's a big debate about it. And this leads to the original of origin and the inner sense of Scripture. What happens in the resolution that gains the day in the majority vote, so to speak, is that, wait a second. We only knew about the Messiah because of the Jewish scriptures. The Jewish scriptures were always testifying to a Messiah. God is in those scriptures. God is speaking in those scriptures. And now maybe what we but then the Messiah came. And now we have these new ways we stand in our appreciation of whatever you want to call it, religion, spirituality is, that we should honor our history, and therefore we do have a new covenant. We have a new deal, right? Remember covenant with George Dahl, responsibility and promise and responsibility. We have a new covenant now. So there's an old covenant and a new covenant. And there's an Old Testament that is still valuable to us. And here's the big move on the text. And believe it or not, this caught the day. If God, the author of the Jewish scriptures, knows about the Messiah all along and is testifying to it, then that all-knowing presence in the text must be everywhere in the text. And therefore, if it's not clear in the plain sense of the text, it's within the text at another level, at another space. And that began a practice of understanding how to get at the deeper divine message anywhere in the plain, even if it's just talking about, I went down to the store to get another 6-pack of Coke, right? Well, of course, which kind of Coke? I mean, I'm going to, so that began an attempt to develop a real structure of thought about how to honor the sacred depths of the text. And that's how the Old Testament was saved. For Christians, was its belief in this inner sense, that's where the same thing we can talk about in the New Testament is already been talked about in the Old Testament. And of course, Swedenborg rarely spends much time in the New Testament except for the book of Revelation. Because, as he says in a couple of places, the Gospels are more open on the page for the divine power, even though he will reference parts of the Gospels when he's referencing 25 other scriptures to buttress his point about this, that, or the other. So enough about that, but thank you for the question. It's a great story. It's a great story on the first evolution of a hermeneutic of the inner sense of the text and how it got going. It came out of a church argument about the Old Testament. Yeah, Trevor? Oh, yes,
Yeah,
Sally?
thanks for delivering, years, and decades, and millennia of study in one short period. My head was swimming with that, but it's wonderful effort. If having a hard time exactly putting this into words, but I'll try to keep it short. What do you make of, or is anyone out there studying what the current modes of understanding are currently today across many religions, from rather disturbing literalism all the way to really just having a foundation in love and love to the neighbor and love of God, which is, I feel, very deeply felt across many religions, and people saying, I'm spiritual but not religious. But so the religious traditions, but also the bigger new church sense that it's not us, like us, it's everyone us.
Yeah, I mean, so I think let's just stick with the Christian realm. A vast section of contemporary Christians, especially those who have a lot more schooling, which some of my friends tell me that makes you worse, do not at all believe in literalism. And so there's a lot of Christians who would never go to the literalist place to be saying harmful things, taking these drastic positions. So there's a whole way, but there's a lot of terrific work on the text to come through an appropriation of meaning when you engage the historical situation of the text, what they're wrestling with in that period, trying to understand what's going on at the time this text was being formed, and how do we relate to similar issues in our time and from our sense of the higher truths of spirituality. How then do we take that forward into an interpretation of living? That, I think, is the mainstay of the liberal main lines. I think mostly Catholicism. But then there's still a lot of literalism going on who hate the whole, what I just said. They think that's a complete wrong turn. So that's it, yeah.
We're calling time because the teachers need to get to their classes, but we will have discussion group in 10 minutes. So if you want to grab a cup of tea and come back for discussion, there'll be lots of time for more sharing. Thank you, Jim.